The morning sun peeked through the clouds as Maria Suarez clutched her small suitcase in one hand and a worn piece of paper with an address in the other. The bus had dropped her off at the edge of what locals called Millionaire's Row, a stretch of road lined with properties hidden behind tall gates and thick hedges. Maria took a deep breath, straightened her simple blue dress, and walked toward the largest gate at the end of the road. 27 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that carried both determination and weariness. Maria had not planned on becoming a housemaid. 6 months ago, she had been preparing for her final recital at the community music school, where her piano teacher had been grooming her for a scholarship. But life had other plans. Her mother's illness had consumed their small savings, and after her passing, the mounting debts had forced Maria to set aside her music sheets and look for steady work. The iron gates of Blackwell Manor loomed before her, intimidating in their grandeur. She pressed the intercom button, and after identifying herself, heard a mechanical buzz as the gates slowly swung open. The driveway seemed endless, curving through perfectly manicured gardens before, revealing the mansion itself, a 3-story stone structure that looked like it belonged on the cover of a history book rather than in the suburbs of a modern city. A stern-faced woman in her 50s waited at the entrance, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun, her black dress crisp and spotless. "You're the new maid? Maria Suarez?" The woman looked her up and down with a critical eye. "I'm Mrs. Powell, the head housekeeper. You're 10 minutes late." "I'm sorry," Maria apologized, trying to hide how much her feet hurt from the long walk from the bus stop. The bus was delayed. Mrs. Powell didn't acknowledge the excuse. "Follow me. I'll show you to your quarters and explain your duties." As they walked through the mansion, Maria couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the opulence around her. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings. Artwork that probably cost more than she would earn in a lifetime decorated the walls, and the floors were a mix of polished marble and rich hardwoods that gleamed under the light. "The Blackwell family has certain expectations," Mrs. Powell explained as they walked. "Mr. Robert Blackwell is one of the most successful investment bankers in the country. His time is extremely valuable, and he expects absolute perfection in his home." She lowered her voice slightly. "And then there's the young master, Thomas. He has special circumstances." Maria nodded, remembering what the employment agency had mentioned. Something about the son of the house having health issues, though they hadn't specified what. "The most important rule in this house," Mrs. Powell continued, stopping to face Maria directly, "is quiet. Absolute quiet, especially in the East Wing. No loud footsteps, no clattering of cleaning supplies, no humming or whistling while you work. If you can't maintain silence, you won't last a week here." The warning seemed extreme, but Maria nodded again. She needed this job desperately. Mrs. Powell showed her to a small but neat room on the 3rd floor, where the staff quarters were located. "Uniform is provided. Meals are at 6 a.m., noon, and 7 p.m., unless you're assigned to dinner service. Days off are every other Sunday." "Any questions?" Maria had dozens, but she simply shook her head, not wanting to appear difficult on her first day. "Good. Change into your uniform and meet me in the kitchen in 15 minutes. I'll show you where the cleaning supplies are kept." Left alone, Maria quickly changed into the provided black dress with a white apron, carefully placing her most treasured possession, a faded photograph of her grandmother seated at a grand piano, on the small bedside table. Her grandmother had been the one to introduce her to music, teaching her piano on an old upright they'd squeezed into their tiny apartment. "Music speaks when words fail," her grandmother used to say. Looking at the photograph, Maria whispered a silent promise that this setback was temporary. Somehow she would find her way back to music. The first few days at Blackwell Manor were exhausting. Maria learned the art of invisible service, cleaning rooms without being seen, moving through hallways like a ghost, even modifying her cleaning routine to minimize noise. The staff rarely spoke above whispers, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a library than a home. It wasn't until her 5th day that Maria finally glimpsed Thomas Blackwell. She was dusting the hallway outside the library when a door opened at the far end. A young man in his late teens emerged, one hand trailing along the wall as he walked. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that fell across his forehead, and he moved with a careful, measured pace. Mrs. Powell, who was supervising Maria that morning, quickly pulled her into a nearby room. "That's the young master," she whispered. "He lost his sight 2 years ago. Viral infection that attacked his optic nerves, at least that's what we were told. He was away at boarding school before that, set to follow in his father's footsteps. Now he barely leaves his rooms. Maria peeked through the doorway, watching as Thomas made his slow way down the hall, his fingers ghosting along the wall for guidance. Mr. Blackwell has specialists fly in from all over the world, Mrs. Powell continued, but so far nothing has helped. The doctors say his other senses have become heightened to compensate, especially his hearing. That's why we maintain such strict rules about noise. Maria felt a pang of sympathy watching the young man navigate the hallway with such careful concentration. Before his world went dark, he must have moved through these same spaces with the confidence of someone who had everything: wealth, prospects, a bright future. Now he resembled a prisoner in his own home. Does he have friends who visit? Or teachers? Maria asked quietly. Mrs. Powell's expression softened slightly. He refused to continue with tutors after the first few months. As for friend, she shook her head. Young people can be cruel. They don't know how to act around someone who's different. The few who came at first stopped coming. Now it's just his father, the staff, and the doctors. That night, as Maria lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, she couldn't stop thinking about Thomas Blackwell. She understood isolation all too well. After her mother died, many of her friends had drifted away, uncomfortable with her grief and financial struggles. But at least she could still see the world, still hope for a different tomorrow. During her third week at the manor, Maria was assigned to clean the rarely used rooms in the West Wing. Most of these spaces had furniture draped in white cloths, giving them a ghostly appearance. But one room at the end of a long corridor was different. As Maria pushed open the heavy double doors, she found herself in a beautiful conservatory with floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the space in natural light. In the center of the room stood a magnificent grand piano, a Steinway concert grand. That must have cost a small fortune. Unlike the other unused furniture in the wing, this piano wasn't covered. Instead, it gleamed under the sunlight, though a fine layer of dust suggested it hadn't been played or even dusted in quite some time. Maria glanced around to make sure she was alone, then approached the instrument with reverence. Her fingers itched to touch the keys, to hear what kind of sound this magnificent instrument would produce. But she remembered Mrs. Powell's warnings about noise and reluctantly began dusting around it instead. As she worked, she noticed photographs on the walls. A beautiful woman seated at this very piano, sometimes alone, sometimes with a much younger Thomas beside her on the bench. In some of the later photos, the boy was playing while the woman watched with obvious pride. That's the late Mrs. Blackwell, a voice said, making Maria jump. One of the older maids, Grace, had entered the room. Sorry to startle you. I saw the doors open and wondered who was in here. This was her piano? Maria asked, looking back at the magnificent instrument. Grace nodded. She was quite famous before she married Mr. Blackwell, a concert pianist who performed all over Europe. She taught young Thomas from the time he could reach the keys. The older woman sighed. After she passed cancer 5 years ago, Mr. Blackwell closed up this room. And then when Thomas lost his sight, well, the music died in this house completely. Maria felt a lump form in her throat. No one plays it anymore, ever? Mr. Blackwell's orders. He said it reminded him too much of her. Grace checked her watch. We should get back to work before Mrs. Powell comes looking. That evening, after completing her duties, Maria found herself drawn back to the conservatory. The moon was full, casting silver light through the large windows and illuminating the piano like a scene from a dream. She knew she was risking her job. Not only was she in a part of the house where staff weren't supposed to go after hours, but she was contemplating breaking the cardinal rule about noise. Still, something stronger than fear pulled her forward. Sitting down on the bench, she ran her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing down, simply feeling their cool smoothness beneath her fingertips. It had been months since she'd touched a piano. The ache of missing it was almost physical. Just one piece, she whispered to herself, very softly. Maria began to play Debussy's Clair de Lune, her fingers remembering every note despite the months away from any keyboard. She played pianissimo, as softly as possible, the gentle notes floating in the moonlit room like delicate bubbles. The Steinway's touch was responsive and the tone exquisite, even at such a low volume. She became so lost in the music that she didn't notice the tears streaming down her face, didn't hear the almost imperceptible sound of the door opening wider, and didn't see the tall figure who stood in the shadows. his useless eyes closed but his ears drinking in every note as if they were drops of water in a desert. In that moment, in that silent house where grief had smothered joy and darkness had extinguished hope, something long dormant began to stir, and neither the maid at the piano nor the blind Heir listening from the shadows could possibly imagine how their lives were about to change. For 3 nights, Maria returned to the conservatory after her duties were complete. Each time she told herself it would be the last, that she couldn't keep risking her job for these stolen moments with the magnificent Steinway. But the pull of the music was too strong, like a thirst she couldn't quench any other way. On the 4th night, she chose Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, playing with her eyes closed, letting the gentle melody wash over her. The piece was melancholy yet beautiful, like remembering something precious that had been lost. As the final notes faded into silence, a voice spoke from the darkness near the door. "Please," it said softly, "don't stop playing." Maria gasped, her hands jerking away from the keys as if they'd suddenly turned red hot. Thomas Blackwell stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, his face turned toward the sound of the piano. "I'm so sorry," Maria stammered, rising quickly from the bench. "I know I shouldn't be here. I didn't mean to—" "No, please," Thomas interrupted, taking a careful step into the room. "I've been listening every night. I've never heard anyone play like that except my mother." Maria remained frozen, torn between fear of losing her job and the vulnerability she heard in the young man's voice. At 19, Thomas Blackwell was caught in that space between boyhood and manhood, his face showing both at once, the softness of youth and the harder edges that came with suffering. "You're one of the maids?" he asked, taking another hesitant step forward. "Yes," Maria admitted. "Maria Suarez. I just started 3 weeks ago." A faint smile touched Thomas's lips. "You clean the 2nd floor corridor on Tuesdays and Thursdays. You use lemon-scented polish on the banisters." Maria blinked in surprise. "How did you know that? When you lose one sense, the others compensate." Thomas gestured vaguely toward his eyes, which were a clear blue but unfocused, looking slightly past her rather than at her. "I can identify everyone in the house by their footsteps and their scent. You walk quickly but carefully and you smell like lemons and sometimes like fresh laundry." He took another step forward and his hand bumped against a side table. With practiced movements, he oriented himself and continued toward the piano. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the bench. "Of course," Maria said, stepping aside. "It's your piano." Thomas found the bench and sat down, his fingers hovering over the keys without touching them. "Not really. It was my mother's. I haven't played since before." His words trailed off, but Maria understood. "Since before the darkness, you used to play?" she asked gently. Thomas nodded. "Since I was 5. My mother taught me until I was 12. Then I had a professional instructor. I was preparing for my first public recital when I got sick." His fingers finally descended, picking out a simple melody, Beethoven's Für Elise, the beginning that every piano student learns. But his timing was off, his fingers uncertain on the keys he could no longer see. After a few halting measures, he stopped, his hands curling into fists on his lap. "I tried after it happened, but I couldn't. Everything was different. The teacher my father hired didn't know how to help someone who couldn't see the music, couldn't see the keys." Maria felt her heart ache for him. She thought of her grandmother, who in her final years had developed cataracts so severe she could barely see, yet she had continued to play, her fingers remembering what her eyes could not. "Would you play something else?" Thomas asked, breaking into her thoughts. "Please?" Despite her fear of discovery, Maria couldn't refuse. She sat beside him on the bench, careful to leave space between them, and began to play Bach's Prelude in C major. She chose it deliberately, a piece where the pattern remained consistent, where the beauty was in the mathematical precision of the notes. Thomas sat silently beside her, his head slightly tilted, absorbing every note. When she finished, he asked, "How long have you been playing?" "Since I was 6, Maria replied. "My grandmother taught me on an old upright in our apartment." "Nothing like this," she added, running her fingers reverently over the Steinway's polished surface. "You play beautifully," Thomas said, "better than my instructor ever did. He was technically perfect, but there was no feeling." They sat in silence for a moment, the moonlight casting long shadows across the room. Maria knew she should excuse herself, returned to her room before someone noticed her absence. But something held her there, the rare animation in Thomas's face. Perhaps, or the simple human connection that had been missing in this cold, silent mansion. Could I? Thomas began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider. Never mind. I shouldn't keep you. You'll get in trouble if anyone finds out you've been playing. Maria looked at him, at the way his fingers still hovered near the keys, yearning but uncertain. In that moment, she made a decision that would change both their lives. I could teach you, she said quietly. Thomas turned toward her voice, his expression a mix of surprise and disbelief. Teach me? But I already know how to play. Or I did. I mean, I could help you relearn, without needing to see the keys. She moved closer on the bench. Here, give me your hands. Hesitantly, Thomas held out his hands. Maria took them gently and placed them on the keys. Close your eyes, she instructed. They're already pretty closed for business, Thomas said with unexpected dry humor. Maria laughed softly. Fair enough. But I'm going to close mine too. We'll both play in the dark. She guided his right hand to middle C. Feel the position of the key under your finger. Now, without looking, can you find the two black keys that come next and then the space between them? Slowly, Thomas moved his finger, feeling his way across the keyboard. Here? He asked, pressing gently on a key. Yes, that's D. Now, using that as your landmark, can you find E? For the next half hour, Maria guided Thomas through a simple exercise, helping him rediscover the geography of the keyboard through touch alone. His progress was remarkable. His fingers remembered more than he realized, and his ear for pitch was perfect. You're a natural teacher, Thomas said as they finished the exercise. Have you taught before? Maria shook her head, then remembered he couldn't see the gesture. No, not formally. I helped younger students sometimes, but I never had official students. Why did you become a maid, if you don't mind my asking? Thomas's face was turned toward her, genuinely curious. Maria hesitated, then decided on honesty. My mother got sick last year, cancer. The treatments took all our savings and then some. After she passed away, I had to drop out of music school to pay the debts. This was the best-paying job I could find without a degree. Thomas was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry about your mother. Thank you, Maria said simply. I'm sorry about yours too. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, startling them both. I should go, Maria said reluctantly. Mrs. Powell does bed checks sometimes. Thomas nodded. Yes, of course. He paused, then added, Could we do this again? The hope in his voice made it impossible to refuse. Tomorrow night? She suggested. Same time? A genuine smile spread across Thomas's face, transforming his features. For the first time, Maria could see the boy he must have been before tragedy struck. I'll be here, he promised. Maria slipped out of the conservatory and made her way back to the servants' quarters, her heart lighter than it had been in months. She knew she was risking her job, her livelihood, but something about Thomas's determination called to her. Perhaps, she thought, they could help each other find their way back to music. The next night, Maria arrived at the conservatory to find Thomas already there, sitting at the piano bench, his fingers tracing the keys without pressing them. He had found his way there alone, she realized, navigating the dark hallways from memory. You came, he said, turning toward the sound of her footsteps. I promised I would, Maria replied, setting down a bundle she had brought with her. And I brought something that might help. She unrolled a sheet of sandpaper and began cutting it into small pieces. When my grandmother's eyesight was failing, she used tricks like this, she explained, placing a rough square of sandpaper on the C key. Feel the difference? She asked, guiding Thomas's finger first to the sandpaper-covered C, then to the smooth D beside it. Yes, he said, exploring the contrast. The rough one is C. Exactly. We'll mark the key landmarks, all the C's, the middle F, and so on. Eventually, you won't need them anymore. But they'll help you orient your hands without having to search for the keys. Thomas ran his fingers over the keyboard, finding each sandpaper marker. That's brilliant, he said, genuine admiration in his voice. Now let's try a simple exercise, Maria suggested. I'll play a note and you try to find it. She pressed a key and Thomas listened carefully before finding the same note. They continued this game, Maria playing progressively more complex patterns for Thomas to repeat. His ear was extraordinary, and within an hour, he was reproducing short melodies with only occasional mistakes. You're a quick learner, Maria said, impressed by his progress. "I have a good teacher," Thomas replied. He hesitated, then added, "and a reason to learn again." Their midnight lessons continued for 2 weeks. Maria introduced other techniques. Textured stickers on the sheet music that Thomas could feel with his fingers, rhythmic patterns he could memorize, ways of positioning his hands that didn't require sight. Thomas absorbed it all eagerly, pushing himself to practice during the day when Maria was working. One night, as Maria was showing Thomas how to navigate a particularly tricky passage in Mozart's sonata in C major, the conservatory door creaked. They both froze, Maria's heart pounding in her chest. "Young master?" Mrs. Powell's voice called from the hallway. "Is that you making noise at this hour?" Thomas squeezed Maria's hand reassuringly. "It's all right," he whispered. Then raising his voice, he called out, "Yes, Mrs. Powell. I couldn't sleep and thought I would try playing again." The housekeeper appeared in the doorway, her stern face showing surprise at seeing Thomas at the piano. Then her eyes fell on Maria, and her expression hardened. "Miss Suarez, what are you doing here at this hour? This area is off limits to staff after dinner." Before Maria could stammer an excuse, Thomas spoke firmly. "I asked her to come, Mrs. Powell. I needed assistance with the piano." Mrs. Powell's eyes narrowed. "With all due respect, young master, your father has strict rules about staff duties." "Then perhaps," Thomas said with newfound confidence, "it's time to change those rules." He turned his face toward where he knew Mrs. Powell stood. "Please don't mention this to my father yet. I'd like to tell him myself when the time is right." The housekeeper hesitated, caught between loyalty to her employer and the undeniable change in the young man she had watched withdraw from life over the past 2 years. Finally, she gave a curt nod. "Very well. But I expect both of you to be in your proper places by 1 o'clock. After she left, Maria let out the breath she'd been holding. "That was close," she whispered. Thomas smiled, the moonlight catching on his features. "Worth the risk," he said simply, and placed his hands back on the keys. Now where were we? The household staff noticed the change in Thomas before anyone else. The young man who had spent 2 years hidden away in his room, speaking only when necessary, was now humming quietly to himself as he moved through the hallways. His face, once a careful mask, occasionally broke into spontaneous smiles. Most remarkably, he had begun to venture into parts of the house he had avoided since losing his sight, his confidence growing as he mapped the spaces in his mind. "It's like watching someone wake up from a long sleep," Grace whispered to Maria one afternoon as they folded linens together. "Whatever you're doing with him in that music room, it's working magic." Maria kept her eyes on the sheet in her hands, smoothing out imaginary wrinkles. "I'm not doing anything special. He just needed someone to show him a different way of playing. Well, Mrs. Powell hasn't reported you to Mr. Blackwell yet, which is a miracle in itself," Grace said with a knowing look. "She runs this house like a military operation, but even she has a soft spot for that boy." Indeed, while Mrs. Powell maintained her stern demeanor, she had become an unlikely ally. She rearranged Maria's cleaning schedule to free her evenings and sometimes forgot to mention when Maria was absent from staff dinner. Once she even left a small plate of sandwiches outside the conservatory door during a particularly long practice session. The lessons themselves had evolved. What began as simple exercises in finding keys by touch had developed into something more comprehensive. Maria taught Thomas to visualize the music in his mind, to feel the rhythm in his body, to listen not just with his ears but with his whole being. "Music isn't just about seeing notes on a page," she told him during one lesson. "It's about hearing the spaces between the notes, feeling the push and pull of tempo, understanding the story the composer is telling." For his part, Thomas was a dedicated student, practicing for hours during the day when Maria was working. He had a natural talent that even blindness couldn't diminish, and a determination that pushed him through frustration when his fingers couldn't find the right keys, or when a difficult passage eluded him. One night, about a month into their lessons, Thomas surprised Maria by playing a piece she hadn't taught him, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the first movement. His performance wasn't perfect. He missed a few notes and his timing faltered in places, but the emotion he brought to the piece, the delicate balance between melancholy and hope, brought tears to Maria's eyes. "That was beautiful," she said when he finished. "When did you learn that?" Thomas ducked his head, almost shy. I've been practicing during the day. I wanted to surprise you. Well, you succeeded. Maria sat beside him on the bench. You know, Beethoven wrote that sonata when he was going deaf. He could still hear some things, but he knew he was losing his music bit by bit. Yet he kept composing, Thomas said thoughtfully, even after he couldn't hear anything at all. Because the music wasn't just in his ears, Maria replied. It was in his mind, his heart, his soul. She took his hand and placed it over his chest. Just like it's in yours. As October turned to November, the weather grew colder. The conservatory, with its large windows and minimal heating, became chilly during their evening sessions. Thomas arranged for electric space heaters to be placed in the room, and Grace supplied Maria with a thick cardigan that had belonged to a previous housekeeper. What about your father? Maria asked one night as they warmed their hands over a heater. Won't he notice the increased electricity use? Or ask about the heaters? Thomas shook his head. He's rarely home before midnight these days. Some big acquisition his company is working on. Besides, he added with a hint of bitterness, he hasn't set foot in this part of the house in years. Maria heard the pain beneath his words. In the weeks they'd been working together, Thomas had shared bits and pieces about his relationship with his father, how close they had been when his mother was alive, and how that bond had fractured after her death. Robert Blackwell had thrown himself into his work, leaving his son at boarding schools. Then when Thomas lost his sight and had to return home permanently, neither knew how to bridge the distance that had grown between them. He can't even look at me now, Thomas had confided once. I can hear it in his voice, the way he always stands at the doorway of my room instead of coming in, how he keeps conversations short. It's like he doesn't know what to do with a son who's broken. You're not broken, Maria had replied fiercely. Different, yes. Adapting, yes. But not broken. Now as they sat in the chilly conservatory, Thomas seemed lost in thought, his fingers absently playing a simple melody. I want to show him, he said suddenly. My father. I want him to hear me play again. Maria felt a flutter of anxiety. Are you sure? We've only been working together for a month. I'm sure. Thomas's face was set with determination. His birthday is next week. He always takes that day off work. It's the one tradition he's kept since my mother died. I thought maybe I could play for him. Nothing complicated, just something to show him that I'm still here, still trying. The vulnerability in his voice made Maria's heart ache. Despite his family's wealth and privilege, Thomas was just a young man who missed his father, who wanted to make him proud. I think that's a wonderful idea, she said. What would you like to play for him? They spent the next week preparing. Thomas chose Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the same piece Maria had been playing the first night he found her in the conservatory. It was a challenging piece, but one that suited Thomas's expressive style and growing confidence. They practiced relentlessly, refining each phrase, working through difficult passages until Thomas could play them with his eyes closed, a joke he made often, finding humor in his condition in a way he never had before. The night before his father's birthday, Thomas was unusually quiet, his hands trembling slightly as they moved over the keys. What if I mess up? He asked, stopping in the middle of the piece. What if I hit wrong notes or lose my place? Maria placed her hand over his. Then you'll find your way back, just like you've done 100 times in practice. But Thomas, she waited until he turned his face toward her. Even if you play every note perfectly, your father might not react the way you hope. Are you prepared for that? Thomas was silent for a long moment. No, he admitted finally. But I have to try. If there's even a chance it might reach him, I have to try. The next day, Maria was assigned to clean the library and adjacent sitting room, where Robert Blackwell usually spent his birthday morning reading the newspapers and drinking coffee. She worked quickly, her stomach fluttering with nervous excitement for Thomas. She had just finished dusting the bookshelves when the man himself walked in, tall and imposing in a casual sweater that probably cost more than Maria's monthly salary. His hair was silver at the temples, his face lined with the stress of a demanding career and personal tragedy. Good morning, he said, glancing briefly at Maria before settling into his armchair. Good morning, sir. Happy birthday. The words slipped out before Maria could stop them. Mr. Blackwell looked up, surprised that a maid would know such personal information. Thank you, he said after a moment, then returned to his newspaper. Maria hesitated by the door, wondering if she should say something about Thomas, give some hint of what was to come. but it wasn't her place, and she didn't want to ruin the surprise. Instead, she slipped out quietly and hurried to the east wing. She found Thomas in his room, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and slacks, his hair neatly combed. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, hands clasped tightly in his lap. "He's in the sitting room," Maria said softly, closing the door behind her. "Are you ready?" Thomas stood, smoothing invisible wrinkles from his shirt. "As ready as I'll ever be." He picked up his cane, a sleek black one he rarely used inside the house anymore, and took a deep breath. Will you come with me? Just to the door?" "Of course." They walked together through the mansion, Thomas using his cane more for reassurance than necessity. He knew the path to the conservatory by heart now, could count the steps between landmarks, could feel the slight change in flooring between carpet and hardwood and marble. Outside the sitting room, Thomas paused. Through the partially open door, they could see Robert Blackwell still reading his newspaper, a cup of coffee cooling on the table beside him. "What if he doesn't come?" Thomas whispered, a note of panic in his voice. Maria squeezed his arm gently. "Then we'll try again another day. But he'll come." "I know he will," Thomas nodded, straightening his shoulders. Without another word, he continued down the hall to the conservatory, his cane tapping lightly on the floor. Maria watched him go, pride swelling in her chest. Whatever happened next, Thomas had already won a tremendous victory over his fears. She had promised to stay out of sight, to let this moment belong to father and son alone. But she couldn't help lingering near the sitting room, hoping to see what would unfold. She didn't have to wait long. A minute later, the first notes of Chopin's Nocturne floated through the hallway, hesitant at first, then growing stronger, more confident. The beautiful melody, both melancholy and sweet, filled the otherwise silent house. Maria held her breath, watching Robert Blackwell. He froze, the newspaper slipping from his fingers to the floor. For several heartbeats he didn't move, his face a mask of shock and something deeper, more painful. Then, slowly, he rose from his chair and walked to the door. He paused at the threshold, looking down the hallway toward the source of the music, toward the son he had kept at arm's length for so long. And as the nocturne reached its emotional peak, Robert Blackwell stepped into the hallway and began walking toward the conservatory, each step bringing him closer to the child he'd almost lost and the music that might help him find his way back. Maria held her breath as Robert Blackwell walked toward the conservatory. She followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows, wanting to be close enough to support Thomas if needed, but far enough away to give father and son their privacy. The music continued, Thomas pouring his heart into every note. There were small mistakes here and there, a hesitation, a slightly fumbled transition, but they only made the performance more honest, more human. This wasn't a perfect recital. It was a son reaching out to his father in the only way he knew how. Robert paused at the conservatory doorway. From her vantage point, Maria could see his face, the tightly controlled expression of a man who had buried his emotions so deeply he no longer knew how to access them. But as the music washed over him, something in that mask began to crack. His eyes glistened in the morning light. For a long moment he stood frozen at the threshold, as if crossing it would mean acknowledging something he wasn't ready to face. Then, as Thomas reached a particularly moving passage, Robert took a deep breath and stepped inside. Thomas didn't stop playing. He had heard the footsteps, recognized the distinctive gait of his father, felt the subtle shift in the air as someone entered the room, but he kept his fingers moving over the keys, determined to finish what he had started. Only when the final notes faded did he speak, his face turned toward where he sensed his father standing. "Happy birthday, Dad." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Maria pressed herself against the wall outside, her heart pounding. She shouldn't be witnessing this private moment, but she couldn't make herself walk away. "Thomas." Robert's voice was rough, as if he hadn't used it in years. When did you start playing again?" Thomas's hands rested on the keys, not pressing down. "About a month ago. I had help." Another pause, heavy with unasked questions. Then, "It was beautiful." Just 3 simple words, but they seemed to fill the space between father and son like light flooding a dark room. Maria saw Thomas's shoulders relax, saw the hint of a smile touch his lips. "It's not perfect," Thomas said. "I'm still learning how to play without seeing the keys. But I'm getting better." Robert moved further into the room, his steps hesitant. Your mother would be—" His voice caught. "She would be proud. I miss her," Thomas said quietly. "I miss how things were before. How we were." The raw honesty seemed to hit Robert like a physical blow. He sank onto a chair near the piano, his composure finally crumbling. "Thomas, I've been a terrible father. After your mother died, I didn't know how to— And then when you lost your sight, You didn't know what to do with me." Thomas finished for him. "I know, neither did I. That's no excuse. You needed me and I wasn't there." Robert leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly. "I threw myself into work because it was easier than facing what happened. I convinced myself I was doing it for you, to secure your future, but the truth is I was hiding. From my grief, from your pain, from my own failure to protect you both." Thomas turned on the bench to face his father more directly. "I was angry at you for a long time," he admitted. "But mostly I just missed you. We lost Mom, and then it felt like I lost you too. And then when I got sick and everything went dark—" He gestured vaguely toward his eyes. "It was like losing everything all at once." "I'm so sorry," Robert said, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this." Thomas's hand found the piano keys again, playing a soft, simple melody, something that sounded like a lullaby. "Maybe we start here, with music. Mom always said music speaks when words fail." For several minutes, Robert just listened, watching his son's fingers move with growing confidence over the keys. When Thomas finished, Robert cleared his throat. "You said you had help learning to play again. Mrs. Powell mentioned something about one of the maids." Maria froze, her stomach dropping. This was it, the moment she would be discovered and likely fired. Thomas didn't hesitate. "Maria, she's been teaching me at night after her shift ends. She's the reason I can play again. The new maid, the young one with the dark hair?" "Yes. She's an incredible pianist, Dad. She was studying music before her mother got sick. She only took this job to pay off medical debts." Robert was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "And she's been teaching you without being asked? Without compensation?" "She's been teaching me as a friend," Thomas said firmly. "And she's done what none of your expensive specialists could do. She helped me find my way back to music. Back to myself." Maria held her breath, waiting for the explosion, the accusations of inappropriate behavior, the threat of dismissal. But it never came. Instead, Robert said softly, "Then I owe her a great deal." Before Thomas could respond, Robert stood up. "I'd like to meet her properly. Not as employer to employee, but as a father grateful for what she's done for his son." He paused, then added with a hint of his old authority, "And I think it's time we moved these lessons out of the shadows, don't you?" For the first time since she'd known him, Thomas laughed, a genuine, unrestrained sound of joy. "I'd like that very much." Maria quickly stepped away from the door, hurrying down the corridor before she was discovered eavesdropping. Her mind raced with confusion and hope. Had she really heard correctly? Was she not about to lose her job? She spent the rest of the morning in a daze, mechanically going through her cleaning duties while replaying the conversation in her mind. When Mrs. Powell summoned her to the library at noon, her heart sank. Perhaps Mr. Blackwell had changed his mind. Mrs. Powell's face revealed nothing as she escorted Maria to the library. "Mr. Blackwell wishes to speak with you," was all she said before opening the door and ushering Maria inside. Robert Blackwell stood by the window, looking out at the gardens. Thomas sat in an armchair nearby, his fingers tapping a rhythm on the armrest. "Miss Suarez," Robert said, turning to face her. "Please sit down." Maria perched nervously on the edge of a chair, folding her hands in her lap to stop them from shaking. "Sir, if this is about the piano lessons—" "It is," he interrupted, but his tone wasn't angry. "My son has told me about your arrangement, about how you've been teaching him to play again when everyone else, myself included, had given up." Maria swallowed hard. "He's a natural musician, sir. He just needed different techniques, different approaches." "Yes, well, apparently all the specialists I consulted missed that rather obvious solution." There was a hint of self-deprecation in his voice. "Thomas also tells me you were studying music before taking this position?" "Yes, sir. At the community college. I had to withdraw when my mother got sick." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "And yet you found time to help my son, expecting nothing in return." "It wasn't entirely selfless," Maria admitted, glancing at Thomas. "I missed playing. The piano in the conservatory is the most beautiful instrument I've ever touched. And your son is a joy to teach. A smile flickered briefly across Robert's face so quickly Maria almost missed it. Be that as it may, I can't have my staff working extra hours without compensation. Especially not skilled work like music instruction. Here it comes, Maria thought. The dismissal. Therefore, Robert continued, I'd like to formally change your position in this household. If you're agreeable, of course, Maria blinked in confusion. I don't understand. I'm offering you a new job, Miss Suarez, as Thomas's full-time music instructor and companion. The salary would be significantly higher than your current position, of course, and your quarters would be moved to the family wing. Maria stared at him, certain she had misheard. Sir? I've neglected my son's education and well-being for too long, Robert said, a hint of emotion creeping into his usually controlled voice. He needs someone who understands both music and his unique situation. You seem to be that person. Thomas was grinning now, clearly having been in on this plan. Say yes, Maria, please. I need a proper teacher if I'm going to play in public again someday. In public? Maria looked between father and son, trying to catch up with this sudden turn of events. That's my goal, Thomas said firmly. To perform again. To show other people like me that blindness doesn't have to be the end of dreams. But I need your help to get there, Robert cleared his throat. Additionally, if you accept this position, I would arrange for you to complete your own music education. Private tutors, access to the conservatory's resources, whatever you need. Maria felt tears welling in her eyes. After months of struggling, of watching her own dreams slip further away while she scrubbed floors and dusted shelves, this offer seemed too good to be true. Why? She asked simply. Why would you do this for me? Robert's gaze shifted to his son, his expression softening. Because you gave me back my son. This morning when I heard the piano, for the first time in years I felt like my wife was still with us somehow, and I remembered what it was like before grief drove us apart. He looked back at Maria. I can never repay that debt, but I can ensure that both you and Thomas have the opportunity to pursue your talents. Maria looked at Thomas, who was nodding encouragingly, his face alight with hope and excitement. She thought of her tiny room in the servants' quarters, of the mountain of debt that still loomed over her, of the faded photograph of her grandmother that reminded her daily of dreams deferred. Yes, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I accept. Thomas's grin widened and even Robert allowed himself a small smile. Excellent. Mrs. Powell will help you move your things this afternoon. You can start officially tomorrow. He paused, then added with unexpected warmth, and perhaps when you have time you might consider playing for me as well. I find I've missed music more than I realized. Later that day, as Maria packed her few belongings, she came across the photograph of her grandmother. She held it carefully, tracing the outline of the woman seated at the upright piano, remembering her words. Music finds a way, child. Even in the darkest times, it finds a way back to those who love it. How right she had been. Somehow through all the loss and struggle, music had found a way. Not just for Maria, but for Thomas too, and perhaps even for his father. As she placed the photograph carefully in her suitcase, Maria felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Not just hope, but certainty. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, guided by the language they all understood, the universal, healing power of music. 6 months passed in a whirlwind of changes at Blackwell Manor. The East Wing, once shrouded in silence and shadows, now regularly filled with music. The conservatory had been renovated, its heating improved, the acoustics adjusted, and a small recording studio added in an adjoining room. Most importantly, the grand piano had been meticulously restored by a specialist who traveled from Vienna specifically for the job. Maria had settled into her new role with a mixture of disbelief and determination. Her quarters in the family wing were larger than her entire childhood apartment, with tall windows overlooking the gardens and a small upright piano for her personal practice. 3 days a week, a professor from the city conservatory came to continue her own musical education, fulfilling Robert's promise to help her complete her studies. But the most remarkable transformation had been in Thomas. Under Maria's guidance, his skills had flourished beyond what either of them had thought possible. His sense of touch had become so refined that he could play complex pieces with fewer and fewer mistakes. His musical memory, always strong, had developed to an extraordinary degree. He could hear a piece once or twice and reproduce it almost perfectly. More than his musical abilities, though it was Thomas himself who had changed. The withdrawn, bitter young man Maria had first encountered had given way to someone confident and engaged. He laughed often now, teased his father at dinner, and had even begun reaching out to old friends from school. One morning in early spring, Maria arrived at the conservatory to find Thomas already there, his fingers moving rapidly over the keys as he worked through a difficult passage in Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. He didn't stop when he heard her come in, but a smile spread across his face. "I think I've finally got it," he said when he finished the section, "that transition that's been driving me crazy for weeks." Maria sat beside him on the bench listening as he played it again. "Perfect," she confirmed. "Your timing is exactly right now," Thomas beamed with pride. "It just clicked this morning. I woke up and could hear exactly how it should sound." He paused, his expression becoming more serious. "Do you think I'll be ready for the charity concert next month?" "More than ready," Maria assured him. "You've mastered the piece, Thomas. Now it's just about confidence and enjoying the performance." The charity concert had been Robert's idea, a fundraiser for a foundation supporting visually impaired musicians. It would be Thomas's first public performance since losing his sight, and though he tried to hide it, Maria knew he was terrified. "What if I freeze?" Thomas asked, voicing the fear he'd been carrying for weeks. "What if I forget everything or hit wrong notes and embarrass myself?" "Embarrass my father?" Maria placed her hand over his. "Then you'll take a breath, find your place, and continue just like we've practiced. Besides," she added gently, "your father would be proud of you if you played chopsticks with one finger. He's not coming to hear perfect music. He's coming to see his son do something brave." Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "You'll be there?" "Backstage? Wild horses couldn't keep me away," she promised. "Now let's run through the entire concerto once more, focusing on those emotional dynamics we talked about." Later that afternoon, as they were finishing their session, Robert appeared in the doorway. This had become a regular occurrence. He would often stop by during Thomas's lessons, sometimes just to listen for a few minutes before returning to work. Today, however, he seemed unusually excited about something. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, "but I have news I wanted to share with both of you." Thomas turned toward his father's voice. "What kind of news?" Robert came into the room, holding what looked like an official letter. "I've just heard back from the Westridge School of Music. They've agreed to launch the scholarship program we discussed. 5 full scholarships annually for talented students with financial need, plus a special track for visually impaired musicians." Maria's eyes widened. She knew Robert had been working on establishing some kind of music program, but nothing of this scale. "That's wonderful, Dad," Thomas said, genuinely pleased. "When does it start?" "This fall," Robert replied. "And they're naming it after your mother, the Eleanor Blackwell Memorial Scholarship." His voice softened at his late wife's name. "She always believed music should be accessible to everyone with the passion to pursue it." Thomas smiled at the mention of his mother. "She would have loved that." Robert turned to Maria. "Actually, the reason I wanted to tell you both together is that the school has asked if Thomas would consider becoming an ambassador for the program, giving occasional master classes, speaking to potential students, that sort of thing." "Me?" Thomas looked surprised. "But I'm not a professional pianist." "Not yet," Robert corrected him. "But you have a unique perspective that could inspire others. And after your performance next month, I think people will be quite impressed with your abilities." Maria watched Thomas as he processed this idea. 6 months ago, he wouldn't have believed himself capable of playing in public again, let alone teaching others. Now the possibility seemed to light something in him. "I'd need help," he said thoughtfully. "Someone to work with me on developing teaching methods for students who can't see the keyboard. Perhaps your own teacher might be interested in such a role," Robert suggested, glancing at Maria with a knowing expression. Maria felt a rush of emotion. From housemaid to instructor to potentially helping develop a program for visually impaired musicians, it was beyond anything she could have imagined when she first arrived at Blackwell Manor with her small suitcase and fading dreams. "I would be honored," she said quietly, "but I haven't even completed my own studies yet." "You will," Robert assured her. "In fact, part of this arrangement includes finalizing your degree at Westridge if you're interested. They were quite impressed by your innovative teaching techniques with Thomas." Thomas reached over and found Maria's hand, squeezing it gently. Say yes. We make a good team. Maria laughed, overwhelmed by the offer but also feeling, for the first time in years, that her life was moving in the right direction. Yes, she said. Of course, yes. The night of the charity concert arrived sooner than any of them expected. The venue, a historic theater in the city center, was filled to capacity. The cause had attracted considerable attention, with local media covering the event and several prominent musicians attending in support. Backstage, Thomas paced nervously, his hands opening and closing at his sides. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his hair neatly combed, looking every bit the accomplished pianist he had become. But Maria could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his breathing had become shallow and quick. Thomas, she said, stopping his pacing by placing her hands on his shoulders. Look at me. Well, you know what I mean. A small smile flickered across his face at her joke. I'm terrified, he admitted. I can hear the crowd out there. What if I can't do this? Remember what we talked about, Maria said firmly. Focus on one person. Play for them, not for the crowd. Play for you, Thomas said, nodding, if that helps. Or play for your mother. Or for yourself, for the boy who thought he'd never touch a piano again. Maria straightened his tie. The music is inside you, Thomas. Trust it to come out when you need it. From the stage came the sound of the MC introducing the event, explaining its purpose, thanking the sponsors. Then Robert's voice took over, speaking briefly about the new scholarship program before introducing his son. That's your cue, Maria said, giving Thomas's hand one final squeeze. I'll be right here. Thomas took a deep breath, unfolded his white cane, and walked confidently toward the stage. A stagehand guided him to the piano, where he folded his cane, found the bench, and seated himself with practiced ease. The audience fell completely silent as Thomas adjusted his position, placed his hands on the keys, and paused. For a heart-stopping moment, Maria feared he had frozen after all. Then, without announcement or preamble, he began to play. The piece he had chosen, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, was bold and challenging, especially for a comeback performance. But from the first powerful chords, it was clear that Thomas was more than equal to the task. His fingers flew across the keys with confidence, his body swaying slightly with the emotional intensity of the music. Maria watched from the wings, tears streaming down her face. She knew every note, every phrase, every challenge he had overcome to reach this moment. When he reached the passage that had given him so much trouble, she held her breath, but he moved through it flawlessly, as if he had never struggled with it at all. In the front row, Robert Blackwell sat transfixed, watching his son with undisguised pride. Beside him was an empty seat, reserved symbolically for Eleanor, but Maria had no doubt that Thomas's mother was present in the music, in the love that filled the theater. As Thomas played the final, triumphant notes, the audience erupted in a standing ovation. The applause was deafening, washing over the stage in waves of appreciation and awe. Thomas sat for a moment, his head bowed, absorbing the sound. Then he stood, turning toward the applause with a smile that seemed to light him from within. He took his bows and then, to Maria's surprise, reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small microphone that had been prepared for him. Thank you, he said, when the applause finally quieted enough for him to speak. Music has been my lifeline, my way back from darkness. But I wouldn't be standing here today without my teacher. My friend who showed me that sometimes when one door closes, another opens if you're brave enough to walk through it. He gestured toward the wings where Maria stood. Maria Suarez, would you please join me? Stunned, Maria hesitated before a stagehand gently nudged her forward. As she walked onto the stage, the audience applauded again. Thomas reached out his hand, somehow knowing exactly where she was, and pulled her into a brief embrace. Play with me, he whispered. The piece we've been working on. Our piece. Maria looked out at the audience, at Robert nodding encouragingly from the front row, at the crowd of strangers who had come to support not just Thomas, but all musicians who faced extraordinary challenges. She thought of her grandmother, of her mother, of all the twists and turns that had led her to this moment. Then she sat beside Thomas on the bench, and together they began to play the duet they had composed during their months of working together. A piece called From Darkness, which began with somber, searching notes before gradually building to a celebration of light and possibility. As they played, Maria understood that this night marked not an ending but a beginning. The young man beside her, once lost in his own darkness, had found his way back to music and to life. And she, the maid who had dared to share her gift in secret, had found not just employment or education, but purpose. The final notes of their duet lingered in the air, a promise of all that was still to come. For Thomas, for Maria, and for the countless others who would benefit from the unexpected friendship that had transformed a silent mansion into a house of music once more.